Welcome to today's briefing, which is around the place of religion in the assisted dying debate. This is a current concern in the UK at the moment because the bill is going to be introduced in the Commons next week by the MP Kim Leadbeater, and this will apply to England and Wales. It's the first time the Commons will have debated the issue since 2015. The Lords have debated it several times, but all attempts have been defeated. So we're joined by a panel of distinguished speakers today who will take us through some of the issues involved. So perhaps I can first of all turn to you, Kit Malthouse, MP, and you have pursued this campaign for many years. This is not your bill, it's Kim Leadbeater's bill, but I wonder if you could explain to us what it indicates to you that this is the topic that has been chosen by the person who won the ballot in the private members' bills. This was the issue above all others that was chosen to come before the Commons. Does it indicate to you that there's a groundswell of opinion in favour of it this time round?
Yes, and not just in Parliament, but in the country as well. I mean, when you win the ballot for private members' bill, and it is a lottery, we all put in, I put in, you obviously become the most popular person in Parliament the next day, and lots of groups come to you with their cause that they want you to champion and a change in the law that they want to see. And certainly the lobby groups Dignity in Dying principally, who I work very closely with, and I approached Kim as number one on the list. I have to say there was a Labour MP who went number 7 on the list who immediately committed to taking a bill if she didn't. And I think hearing some of the stories that people have been through over the last few years, the horror stories that they've experienced in their lives, and also the stories of people who've been going to Switzerland to end their lives with some dignity, convinced her that this was a good moment to have the debate and to try and get a change in the law, not least because, as you say, it's 10 years since the Commons last looked at this, back in 2015. And I think the more she's got into the campaign and the more she's met with people who've had a horrible experience and are determined to try and bring about change, the more convinced she is that it's the right time to try and do so.
Now, you're obviously a Conservative MP, she's Labour. There's some speculation that the new intake, particularly of Labour MPs, are of a mind to push this through this time round. Is that your reading of how the Commons will vote?
Well, it's hard to say this early out, but I'm more optimistic now than I was back in 2015. That's exactly right. Not least also because we know from polling that support in the country has strengthened. And of course, in the intervening decade, as you said, many of us have been campaigning on this issue, and there have been some very high profile cases of people who want choice at the end of their life, but have been denied it. So, for example, the most recent, of course, is Esther Rantzen. But even figures like Noel Conway, who for years campaigned during his own degeneration towards his own death, campaigned for a change in the law. And we've seen slowly, MPs changing their minds, some after their own personal experiences, but some because they see the strength of the argument as well. And so, yeah, I mean, I feel optimistic. But in these sensitive and complicated matters, you never know. And we're going to have to work hard, I think, to try and make sure that we do get it over the line with as many colleagues as we can.
Does the fact that it's coming up so early have anything to do with the conversation that Keir Starmer had with Esther Rantzen? He promised her that he would make time for a debate and a free vote on assisted dying. She's really not very well at the moment. Has this been a consideration as to why the Commons is putting it forward quickly?
No, I don't think so. To be honest with you, he's, I think, been a long-term proponent. He was the Director of Public Prosecutions who changed the law, changed the guidance on prosecutions for people who'd been involved in, for example, taking somebody to Switzerland. I think really the reason it's coming now is because an MP won the private member's ballot. She was convinced of the case. she wants to bring the bill forward. So there's an element of kind of chance about it. If somebody had been drawn in the top 10 if the top 10 had been drawn and were opponents, then I don't think we'd have a bill. So I think there's an element of a kind of the stars aligning. But he made the pledge in the manifesto that they'd make government time. Rishi sort of made the same pledge, and the Liberal Democrats made that pledge too. So there was always going to be a time made in this Parliament. The fact that it's coming early is a matter of chance, I think.
Can you explain the process to us? Because it's being presented in the Commons next week, so we'll find out the wording for the first time. But the vote and the debate will come later. How much debate is there in a private member's motion? Does it go through the usual channels of committee stages, or could it all be done and dusted by Christmas?
No, it goes through exactly the same process as any other piece of legislation. So there will be the only difference is the days on which it's done initially. So private members' bills are taken on a Friday, and second reading of this bill will be that. So first reading is just introduction of the bill. As you say, the bill then gets published. Second reading is the debate on the principle of the bill and the House consenting for it to go forward to committee for detailed line-by-line examination, the taking of evidence, that kind of thing. Then it comes back report stage to the Commons, when the Commons debates it again, and other members can put amendments down to it if they so wish. If it gets through report stage, then goes to third reading. Normally that's a kind of rubber stamp, but then it goes off to the Lords for them to examine it as well. So it has exactly the same process as any other legislation. I would point out, though, that it's a mistake to think that the only debate on a bill takes place in the chamber. There's an awful lot of debate and discussion in the House that takes place outside the chamber, not just in committee, but amongst MPs, both formally and informally. Lobby groups come in. There will no doubt be public meetings held where MPs can listen to the debate by lobby groups, no doubt on either side. So while the formal debate of the Commons is important, it's not the only debate that takes place.
Finally, there is a parallel bill in the Lords that Lord Faulkner's putting forward. Do you expect that to be pulled now that this bill is coming into the Commons?
I do. I think Charlie Faulkner's bill was put down because he was, as I say, concerned that we might not get somebody in the private members' bills that wanted to take it forward. Now we have. I suspect he'll be thinking about what he does with his bill. He was always quite clear that it was important the Commons had a say first before it went to the Lords. That that the democratic consent was given before the Lords had a look at it. And so, yeah, if we can get the sequencing right, his bill, I would suspect will go.
Well, thank you for explaining all of that. Can I turn now to Nathan Stillwell? Nathan, you're the assisted dying campaigner at Humanist UK. What has been the role of Humanist UK in the tabling of this bill?
In all honestly, very little. As Kit has very much explained, the moment that the private members bill ballot happened, we obviously emailed Kim, rang Kim, and did exactly the same as Kit said. We explained that we and I personally work with so many people who are dying and suffering and would love to see a dignified choice at the end of their life. But at this stage, no, the ball is very much in Kim's cause. But Humanist UK as an organisation and humanists in general have campaigned on this for over 100 years.
The England and Wales seems to be surrounded at the moment. There's a similar bill being considered in Scotland. The Welsh Senate are going to debate it later this month. The Isle of Man Parliament has approved a bill. Jersey has approved a bill. Guernsey is considering it. Are humanists behind all these developments?
We're not behind all these developments as if we were kind of pulling the strings or anything like that. We support all of these developments, and there's a global humanist movement that supports choice and dignity. And indeed, it's important to point out that this is kind of very much a people-led campaign. It's a grassroots campaign of people saying, I want this choice and dignity at the end of my life. And again, it's not even around the British Isles. France has had this debate, and that debate's ongoing. There's 31 jurisdictions now across the entire globe representing over 450 million people. This is very much a sign of the times.
What is your key reason in Humanist UK for wanting assisted dying?
There's not exactly a key reason. I mean, there's various ethos. We don't believe in a deity. We don't have a scripture. There's nothing that tells us that we're going to go to hell for, thinking or believing a certain thing or certain actions. But humanists do value compassion, choice, and autonomy. Essentially, to really oversimplify our ethos, I want to treat you in the same way that I want you to treat me. And when we're faced with people who are suffering, and again, I hear so many horror stories, and people do phone humanists to share their stories of the end of their life, it makes us want to campaign for choice. And that choice element is very, very important. Humanists have always campaigned for freedom of religion and belief. I very much respect everybody who has very different views on this matter. And my point would say, this is my death, it's my decision. If you don't want an assisted death, that is your choice. You can not go down that route. That's very much your bodily autonomy that comes central to this point. But as a humanist, and in my personal view, this is an option I would want for myself. It's an option I know that my family and my loved ones and my friends want that choice. And so it's very much the choice that we're pushing forwards.
Thank you. Bishop Michael Beasley, you're the Bishop of Bath and Wells, and the bishops have consistently voted against assisted dying when the issue has come up in the Lords. So a similar question to you. What's your key reason for opposing assisted dying?
I can understand that in a pluralistic society such as our own, there will be many different views about assisted suicide. And I can understand why a person might want to take this choice at the end of their life. But I think that depends upon that person having agency. The conversation we're sharing this morning is a conversation of people who are powerful, who can choose, who have the ability to decide what happens to them. As bishops, our concern is for the vulnerable, those who cannot choose or who can be pushed into choosing assisted dying against their best interests and at the behest of others. Now, of course, people will say, oh, well, this is not what this bill is about, that there are going to be major safeguards to prevent that from happening. But I think if you look at other jurisdictions where this has been introduced, principally, I think Canada, then I think what you see in Canada is that we're on an extremely slippery slope altogether. I don't know if any folk here have seen the documentary made by Liz Carr, the silent witness actress, Better Off Dead. That was truly distressing to see how something which had originally been tightly defined had very quickly become a mechanism that was affecting vulnerable people and leading to the end of their lives. It's so notable that the principal speakers against this bill are those who speak for people with disabilities, who I'm sorry are not here this morning to speak for themselves. As bishops, I do think that what we need to have is access to excellent palliative care, and I'm really sorry that's not been part of this morning's discussion either. At the moment, we are funding palliative care through the heroic and generous efforts of people who run charity shops. We should have a much better solution of that, properly funded by government, so that everybody has the ability to die well.
Just to ask you about palliative care, you're talking about hospices there, principally. There's palliative care in hospital there, isn't there, as well?
And that's a particular issue at the moment, that we know that we have a whole national health infrastructure that is either broken, as some people would say, or not in a very good state, to put it mildly. And so we're very concerned that we're having this debate about enabling suicide to happen, when actually what we should be doing is enabling good deaths to happen through really, really good care.
So you mentioned vulnerability, you mentioned palliative care, you mentioned the issue where disabled people, you mentioned the documentary where the issue of disabled people was properly expressed. What about the theological objection to assisted dying?
I think that's where it comes back to being in the public square. I am very happy to advocate for the perspectives of Christian faith and about Christian dignity and how that affects questions of the end of life. I'm happy to advocate for those, but I don't think that's the principal issue at stake in this argument at this time. I think the main issue is, where is the voice of the vulnerable? We are not hearing that, and it is not being amplified.
Do you sometimes feel that you're once more on a course against the tide of public opinion, as so many other issues in the Church of England, with opinion polls showing that there is widespread support for assisted dying?
I can quite see that that assisted dying would seem on the surface to be something that is comparatively simple and maybe even recommendable. I think the problem is that as soon as you see what actually happens in jurisdictions that have introduced palliative care, that it is much more complicated, that the vulnerable are exposed, and that whilst everybody says there will be no slippery slope, if you look at the example of Canada, the slippery slope kicks into action very quickly indeed.
Can you just pick up one other thing before we let you go? Because I know you've got other commitments. And that is the definition of what we're talking about here. We're talking about assisted dying. You described it as assisted suicide. Just unpack those terms for us. What's the difference between the two, and why do you choose one against the other?
I think I choose to say assisted suicide because that is what it is. This is a person choosing to take their own life. I think assisted dying is perhaps used within this discussion to make it seem less based in reality than the truth is.
Thank you very much. Just please do stay with us for as long as you can. And once you've gone, I know we've got Malcolm Brown, who will be...
Thank you. He's a great person to hand on the baton to.
Your issues, yes. So the arguments from religious groups, and what we said at the beginning was this is about the place of religion in the debate over assisted dying. We just heard the comments there from the bishop, but moving over to Dr. Azim Ahmed. Azim, you're the Secretary General of the Muslim Council of Wales. Now, you've written a chapter in a book that looks into many issues around this, and your first sentence, I think, said unequivocally, this is absolutely prohibited in Islam. Can you explain to us the theological argument behind that?
Thank you, Ruth. I mean, it's one of those issues within the broader Islamic tradition where there isn't much diversity in views. And part of that reason is because within the Islamic tradition, through the kind of moral instruction received in the Quran and the teachings of the Prophet, there are very specific cases of assisted suicide, assisted dying, which are prohibited. And there's a distinction made between suicide in the case of a mental health crisis, when it's that the pens are lifted, the person doesn't have that same agency and rational decision-making capacity, and cases where individuals decide to end their life effectively prematurely for, very personal reasons, which is very clearly prohibited in the Islamic tradition. And it will be prohibited whether it's a Muslim undertaking it or whether it is a Muslim doctor or healthcare professional who would be in a position to have to administer it or supervise it. So it's a very, clear moral principle, and it does relate to the sacredness of human life. And I think that is, the broader question here, without going too much into a kind of philosophical, theological debate. Some of this is very practical. We're looking at people whose circumstances may want them to end their life prematurely, but for every experience of individual who is in a very dire situation because of their health and would want to pursue suicide or assisted dying, there is another case of families and individuals for whom the possibility is terrifying because of the implications, whether it's individuals who would feel like they're a burden and want to end their life to prevent other families from feeling that pressure, or whether it's in the case of individuals who may be pushed or otherwise reduced to effectively an economic or financial value. And I think this is really a discussion where, to a certain extent, we have to go back to the very core of what is sacred for us as a society. And I think that's actually very important to kind of clarify collectively. I think we do have to, at a certain point, say there are limits to bodily autonomy and choice. And the sacredness of life is a principle that kind of binds together societies historically and in the contemporary world. And it's one worth defending. And I think that's really what's at the heart of this debate. I think getting maybe too focused on the practical and the, policy implications is important, but it can take us away from that very central question, which is what is at stake in this debate.
What do you mean by sacred?
I think, we're speaking about inviolable lines, things that should be treated as a red line that isn't crossed. And I think, we're living in a pluralistic society. It's important to recognize people will have different sacred lines, different things they hold cherished and absolutely inviolable. But I think as a society, we've come to a point where we do need to sometimes assert that there are things which collectively we will say can't be done. And I think ending life prematurely should be one of them.
What concerns do you have for the implications of this for Muslims in the medical profession? So I was just looking it up earlier, and 10% of the total medical workforce are Muslim, and approximately 17% of doctors who declared a religion. What are you expecting Muslim medical professionals will do if this bill goes through?
I think that's a very good question. It's true, quite a few, especially those pursuing a career in medicine, will be placed in a real ethical conundrum. And with other areas where a Muslim doctor or anyone might face an ethical compromising situation, for example, abortion or similar, there's usually some flexibility in the tradition, passing on to another doctor or sometimes even administering it, recognizing it's that individual's ethical, moral framework that's being followed. But I think in this scenario and in this circumstance, there isn't going to be that much space for individuals to feel comfortable doing this or overseeing this. So I think it will definitely put pressure on the workforce. But I think it's also recognizing it's not just about the impact on certain groups. I feel like crossing that red line of saying that it is possible to end one's life has so many other implications. It's the slippery slope that's been mentioned by the bishop, but it's also the wider ramifications more broadly about how we then say we make decisions about each other and decisions about healthcare more generally. I think it's a red line we shouldn't cross. It's a boundary we shouldn't really pierce beyond.
Thank you. Can I turn now to Rabbi Dr. Jonathan Romain? You are also chair of the Religious Alliance for Dignity in Dying. Just picking up some of those comments from the bishop and from Azim there, there was talk of the sacredness of life. For you, is that the key point of the debate, or are you, like the bishop, arguing this on the basis of other social concerns like palliative care and vulnerability and so forth?
Well, the fact that I'm chair of the Religious Alliance shows, and the Religious Alliance has several hundred members, including clergy, including bishops and imams, and shows that actually there's not a monolithic religious view, but there's a divided religious view, as there is on most cases. And certainly I would want to distinguish very carefully between suicide and assisted dying. In the case of a suicide, when somebody's either depressed or making a political statement, if they hadn't committed suicide, they might well have lived another 20, 30, 40 years. Assisted dying is only when they are terminally ill. And that's one of the red lines. They have to be terminally ill. So in other words, it's not a matter of shortening life, it's a matter of shortening death. And the whole reason behind it is actually a religious reason, and they're practical ones as well, is that we want to help people. I mean, that's why this campaign has been going for so many years, because everybody knows there are a lot of people who die in pain. And of course, palliative care is great and wonderful, and I've been supporting it for many, many years. But it can't help everyone. And it's not me saying that, it's MPs. There was, as you know, Ruth, a Health and Social Care Select Committee by MPs that concluded as recently as I think it was May or June. And they said, the palliative care experts admitted that palliative care cannot help everybody. Plus, and what's crucial for this debate today is that they also said there has not been a slippery slope. I know a lot of people have said that already, but what happens in other jurisdictions like Belgium is they actually started off with a much wider definition of assisted dying, which we're not going to have. And Canada has a totally different legal system, which wouldn't be possible here. And really, if you want to talk about other areas and what's been happening or not happening, you have to talk about Oregon, because Oregon is exactly what Kim Ledbetter and Lord Faulkner, their bill is going to emulate. And not only are they going to emulate that, but it's been going for 25 years. So we've got quarter of a century's worth of experience. So we're not leaping into a dangerous, dark unknown. We're actually know exactly what we're doing, which is giving people options. And that's really what it's about. And if people are concerned about the vulnerable, well, then they should work with MPs to try and make sure that all the safeguards are in place. And that's really very, very key.
You mentioned in your when you have written about this in the past, that you have changed your mind over the years. That at the beginning you were opposed to assisted dying, but now you were in favour of it. What made you change your mind? I think you mentioned actually it was your ministry. It was being a rabbi that made you change your mind.
Exactly right. In fact, there were three things. I suppose I was against it just for almost knee-jerk reasons of life is sacred, which is true and special and valuable, but not when it becomes appalling. And what changed my mind was firstly going to hospice after hospice and seeing people die in pain, despite the best efforts. And the turning point was when I saw a chap who was kneeling on his bed with his head between his knees on his bed. And I said, why are you in this position? He said, it's the only way I can control the pain. And you can replicate that story thousands and thousands of times. And then I found out about Oregon and the fact that this system that we're being proposed here has been working very effectively for 25 years. It's a matter of giving people options. And frankly, it seems to me, in whose interest are we keeping someone alive against their will, if they're suffering and if they're about to die anyway? And from a religious perspective, that's where I'm coming from. I mean, I support very much what Nathan said from a humanist perspective, but this is about helping people we want them to have as good a life as possible. Why shouldn't they have as good a death as possible? So I firmly believe there's nothing sacred about suffering, nothing holy about agony. And if people want to let go of life, say, thank you, God, it's been great so far, but I'm coming to the very end, I'm terminally ill, I'd like to go gently, and then why not let them do so? And by the way, one last thing, assisted dying does not mean somebody else doing it. It means the person themselves getting a prescription and then taking a life-ending medication.
Thank you. I think we've lost Professor Nigel Biggar. I think he's gone, so unfortunately. So can we move to Professor Julian Hughes? You are a retired consultant in old age psychiatry and editor of The Reality of Assisted Dying, Understanding the Issues, which is a collection of essays from people of all kinds of disciplines talking about this same thing. You say at the beginning of the book that the public debate arouses compassion and fear. It's based on emotion. And you believe that the issue is far more complex than that, which is why you have edited this book. Can you explain those complexities for us?
Well, thank you, Ruth. Excuse me, for allowing me to join you in this. I think the thing is that I've co-edited the book with Elora Finlay, Baroness Finlay, and I think our feeling was that at every step of the way, every single bit of the argument is complex. So it's not that one can say there's one complicated thing. The whole thing is complex. And so in everything that in many of the things that I've already heard spoken about, as I've been listening to other people talking, I found myself thinking, well, there are complicated arguments against all of those things. So, for instance, we've heard about I think Kit mentioned the polling, but you can be very critical of polls. So, for instance, there a recent poll. I mean, we're often told that the polling is sort of 75% or whatever, but a recent poll by Living and Dying Well in 2024 in June showed that the figure was 60% of people were in favour of it, but only 36% thought that a change in the law could be made safely. So there are these nuances, and I think that so if you look at the chapter in the book by Andrew Hawkins, he points out that as soon as you start to inform people, the more you inform them, the lower the support for a change in the law goes.
Can I just ask you about the complexities raised in the book on safeguarding and the protection of vulnerable people? And the book, many authors talk about the various checks that have been brought in by the countries that have already brought in assisted dying, and how many approvals are needed for each case and how many are granted each year. And then there's a slippery slope. What safeguarding measures do you think are sufficient if we were to have an assisted dying bill in this country, which would allay your fears?
I don't think there are any that would completely allay my fears, because I think that in some ways, I don't think these things are providing safety when they're just used in a fairly sort of superficial way. So, I mean, something like, for instance, people having the capacity to make decisions. That sounds like a very sensible safeguard. But then you have to think, I suppose the point is that I'm always going to be thinking about the margins. I mean, of course, there are going to be some people who have capacity, and it's clear that they have capacity, and it's fairly straightforward to say that they do have capacity. But there will be people at the margins where capacity is extremely difficult to assess, and where you're left just doubting capacity. A similar issue would be to do with coercion, where it sounds straightforward to say, well, we'll make sure that people aren't coerced. But actually, the moment you change the law, then there is coercion. There's a sort of environmental coercion that somebody at the moment who feels that they're a burden to their daughter or to their family or whatever, there isn't an option of assisted dying or assisted suicide. The moment the law is changed, then there is that option. So there is a kind of environmental coercion on the person to say, well, I am a burden and therefore I should go for this.
You are a doctor. Various groups of doctors have discussed this, and as you say, there are polls assessing their opinion, but the comments from the colleges, as far as I'm aware, correct me if I'm wrong, say, they're not going to make a judgment or take a line, as far as I'm aware. What, in your view, is the impact on the medical profession, particularly the dilemma for doctors working with a patient nearing the end of their life? What are the implications for doctors if this assisted bill goes through?
Well, I think it puts them in a bind. What we know from other countries is that, and from this country, is that most doctors will not want to have much to do with this. I mean, even if they feel that in principle there should be a change in the law, they'll still, by inclination and training, not be keen to be actually intentionally killing people. And that isn't why they went into medicine. I mean, that's certainly what doctors have said to me. They've said, I didn't go into medicine in order to kill people intentionally. And but there are kind of particular things. So, for instance, if you think of people like psychiatrists, I mean, I'm a old age psychiatrist. There's the tension between suicide prevention and suicide promotion. Once we have a law, if somebody comes to see you saying, I feel that I'm at the end of my life, I don't want to carry on living, at the moment, it's very clear what you have to do. You have to support them and so forth, and do all that you can to help them. And we know that lots of people will change their minds because they might be depressed or lonely and so on. But once we have this law, then why should the doctor be trying to prevent suicide rather than trying to promote it? And we know from psychiatric colleagues in Canada that once the law is changed, people say to the doctor, well, you have a duty to kill me because that's what I want. According to the sort of background feeling, if you have your choice should be the thing, your autonomous choice should be the thing that determines everything. But that in itself is questionable. So again, I would point to the book, because there's a fantastic chapter in the book about autonomy written by Baroness O'Neill, which shows that the whole notion of autonomy is actually a rather simplistic notion. None of us has full autonomy. We have, at best, relational autonomy. We always stand in connection with people. So I think doctors will just be put in a bind, because most doctors will not want to intentionally kill people. I think in every country where the law has changed, there's always a group of doctors who will embrace this, and they'll become the ones who go around doing most of the killing. But I think that's unfortunate.
Well, it's time to open this all up for discussion. So there's some questions already in the chat box. If you have a question, please contribute there. But I'm going to ask Nick Spencer from Theos, the think tank Theos, to give your reflections and observations on the discussion so far, please, Nick.
It's been a very helpful discussion, and also a very courteous one, which is encouraging. I think this debate is so sensitive, it absolutely must be conducted courteously. So it's good to see this in an example. It seems to me that the core, there are two considerations here. There's the practical consideration, and the underlying philosophical consideration, and the latter that most interests me. Dignity has been mentioned an awful lot in our discussion. It's central to this debate, but we don't actually necessarily agree on what constitutes dignity. Really, there are two broad philosophical traditions that each lead to a meaning of dignity which is slightly different. One, as we've just heard from Julian, it's a kind of a Kantian autonomy conception of dignity. We honour people's dignity by giving them by recognising their autonomy and giving them choice. The other is a sense of dignity as in terms of relational wholeness, and you honour people's dignity in that regard simply by caring for them. Now, choice is very frequently invoked by people who wish to change the law in this topic, and understandably so. There are lots of very harrowing stories where one is inclined to absolutely honour people's desire to have the choice to end their life, particularly if they are in terminal, their illness is terminal, and obviously if they're in pain. But I guess my concern with that is this. If we do put all our eggs in the autonomy basket, as it were, if we totally identify with a conception of human dignity that rests on people's choice, we find ourselves on a potential slippery slope, but without a philosophical break. By which I mean, if we are mandated to respect somebody's choice in this matter, we do not have a coherent argument to deny them their choice in this matter if they are not terminally ill, but just permanently ill. Or even in some instances, and we've heard this discussed in the Netherlands and prospect in Canada, if they're not even physically ill, but they are mentally suffering. Mental pain can be extremely painful, even if you're not in physical pain. If somebody says to you in that instance, I absolutely want to end my life because it has no purpose whatsoever, and I see no reason for me to continue it, you need a coherent reason to argue against them. And if we have conducted this entire discussion on the basis of autonomy and choice, I don't think we have a coherent reason. That is my concern. I can fully understand the desire to pass this bill if you could guarantee that the restrictions and the safeguards remained very, very tight and that this wasn't normalised. But my real concern is, and I do think Canada and the Netherlands are salient in this, that won't be the case, and that the safeguards will be slowly loosened to a point at which people who are not terminally ill or are not in permanent pain can justifiably ask for their life to be ended.
Thank you. Malcolm Brown.
Thank you. Much of what needs to be said has been said. I want to start, though, by saying, although I'm very nervous indeed about these bills, I have no doubt whatsoever that those arguing for them, Jonathan and Nathan and Kit, are motivated by compassion, which is a Christian virtue as well as a virtue in other traditions. On the other hand, we also know that compassion is a complex
virtue to exercise because of the nature of the person. One's own compassion can be very mixed up with one's own motives, and the appreciation we have of the other can be also extremely limited or complex. And so I want to stress the relational aspect, as others have done, and to do so through an example in parallel where it's absolutely right, in my view, that people are given a choice, but that choice has not in practice worked out as a free choice. And that is the case of women carrying a fetus with Down syndrome, where they are offered the choice of a termination. But many, many women, as we found when we studied this, come away from that feeling intense moral pressure, not articulated directly, but implicitly, that if they do not choose a termination, they are making the wrong choice because it is creating a burden for others and a burden on the state. Now, in the case of assisted suicide, and incidentally, I use the word suicide there because for me it stresses the point about the free choice and agency of the person. This isn't assisted dying because someone else wants you to die, it's because you want to die. So I think Jonathan and I choose the opposite terminology for different reasons. But I think the moral pressure to believe you are going to be a burden, and this is what you should do, we have seen in the case of Down syndrome fetuses, is intense. And we know that for many people, choice comes across as a promise, but there's a massive division in our society between those who, usually university educated, articulate, those for whom choosing the direction of their lives and death possibly is natural and normal, and those whose experience of life is being the subject of other people's choices. And I don't think that this debate has heard enough from those. They may be vulnerable, they may simply be inarticulate. And the pressure on them, I think, we cannot legislate for. It's not about a safeguard. It's about how a social narrative develops when certain possibilities become possible.
Well, this is a first go at it. I'm sure we'll be doing lots more briefings in the future. And we should say, Malcolm, that you're with the Church of England and you're the Director of Mission and Public Affairs, just so I should have said that at the beginning. Kit, would you like to respond?
Yes. I mean, I have to confess to you, I'm finding the conversation a distressing one because of, I guess it seems to me, a tendency to look away from the current situation. And to deny the kind of current reality. So people are already killing themselves with terminal diseases. We know this. Several hundred a year are blowing their brains out, taking overdoses. In fact, many people in hospital are deciding to refuse treatment and starving themselves to death because they're in such pain and agony. And amongst those numbers, we have no idea at the moment who's pressured, who's vulnerable, who might not have mental capacity completely. We don't know. It's completely unregulated. We have one person a week going business class to Switzerland. And of course, we have thousands of people dying agonizing deaths who may want to have a different choice. And so I think that if you like, the kind of willingness to look away from the horror story of the current situation is quite distressing for a lot of people. And it's all very well to seek solace in this idea of improving palliative care. But if you've been involved with the dead and dying, you will know that there are some conditions that palliative care can do nothing about. If you get motor neuron disease, you learn pretty quickly that you're going to choke to death. And there's nothing you can do about that. No palliative care is going to stop that. The last thing that shuts down before your brain is your respiratory system, and you choke. And you know, unless there's some kind of recognition that this unregulated system, which is driving people to do awful things to themselves and get them, you know, I mean, I heard a story the other day of a woman who had cancer in her neck. And so she quietly stockpiled morphine to take an overdose and kill herself, but she miscalculated and didn't realize that the morphine was slow release. So when she took the overdose, it obviously had a big impact, but she survived. She then went into a hospice. The tumors in her neck burst and she drowned. right? These are the horror stories that we can't look away from and that we have to address. And so to me, rather than us moving into a system where there will be allegations of pressure or slippery slope, we're moving into a situation from unregulated to regulated, where we will have some say. Doctors do, under the legislation I assume is coming forward, 2 doctors will have to agree. A judge will have to oversee. There will be cooling off periods. Capacity will be assessed. All of these things will exist that currently don't. And so the idea that people with terminal diseases aren't already taking their own lives, just doing it in horrible ways, is looking away from reality. And then the second thing, just to say that I'm finding slightly distressing, is this ignorance about the idea that doctors don't participate in end of life intentionally at the moment, because they do. Right. So you might think life is sacred, but doctors today make choices about quality of life. Decisions are made about, as they say colloquially, turning off the machines. People in persistent vegetative state. Now, if we're saying, if the theological thing is that all life is sacred, well, that life is deemed not worth preserving, and the machines are turned off. We have DNR notices that are put on people, do not resuscitate as they reach the end of their life. And of course, there's the unspoken, although possibly less now, but the unspoken secondary effect that I'm giving you medication to deal with your pain, but actually as a secondary effect, it's going to shorten your life. So the reality that we're dealing with at the moment is something that I just don't think we can look away from. And to me, the unregulated nature of it means that we have to come in with some safeguards, which also give people choice. And finally, sorry to just use sacredness of life. And the question is, to me, is not primarily what does sacred mean, and I'm not a religious person, but is what is life? Right? We've already said that someone who's in a persistent vegetative state that's accepted in society is not deemed to be a life in the way the rest of us would agree it, and doctors routinely take decisions to turn it off. You will remember, for example, as well, the situation of this child a few years ago where the medical profession went to court to stop parents seeking to say this child should be allowed to die. And in fact, the parents in the end had to go overseas to get treatment. There's a huge court battle about this child's pain being prolonged by parents who would not allow the end of life to proceed. So this notion of life is critical rather than kind of sacred, in my view. And the only person who can judge that for me is not all of you who want to deny me the choice, it's me. The status quo is a choice, and at the moment it's being made by other people, not by me.
What is life is quite a sacred question, though. I'll just offer at that point. Can we go to Professor Julian Hughes? Julian, can you respond to particularly what Kit was saying and expand a little bit on palliative care and how it works and the intention of it?
What Kit has just said, it sounds very good, but again, I say this with all due respect. I think that most of your sentences, Kit, need to be looked at on their own and then chewed over a little bit more. So, for instance, you say, the reality of this thing, we're not facing the reality of this thing. Well, I've been in the reality of this thing. I've been on wards where there are people that are dying. I've looked after people who are dying and so forth. Actually, the fact is that most people have quite calm deaths without tremendous suffering. So, of course, we can go and find people who do have tremendous suffering, but most people don't. Most people die naturally and calmly. And then you say it's unregulated, but of course, in a sense, it is regulated, and because everything that doctors are doing is being regulated, and everything that nurses are doing is being regulated. And it's when those regulations go wrong that then we have terrible catastrophes where doctors or nurses are killing people. You say things like turning off the machine, it's not regulated in some way, but of course it is. It's regulated by the law, by things like the Mental Capacity Act, and by deciding by legal decisions about whether or not somebody still has life in their brain or not, and what might be in their best interests and what they would have wanted to have happened to them and so on. So it's not that doctors just in an unregulated way go around turning people's life support off. But to come back to Ruth's point, I mean, I think a lot more needs to be said about palliative care. I'm aware that, for instance, for the House of Commons Select Committee, of course, if you go to any honest palliative care physician and say, do you think you can help every single person? They're going to say, no, we can't help every single person. But you then might want to explore that further to think, well, do they have enough resources? Do they have enough people? Is there enough research going on in palliative care? I mean, when we have somebody with refractory asthma, in other words, asthma that can't be treated by just the normal drugs, we don't then just give up and say, oh, well, we better go for assisted dying. We think, well, what's an interesting combination of drugs that might be helpful here? Or we think, well, why isn't this person's asthma responding? And then we think, well, maybe there's some sort of environmental thing that's making it not respond. So if we think back to Cicely Saunders talking about the notion of total pain, and so her definition of total pain was that it's physical, psychological, social, and spiritual. And so therefore, if you have somebody who's not responding very well to standard treatments, you might have to take some days to explore what are the psychological issues, what are the social supports that could be put in place. I mean, I used to work in a hospice at one point. I remember very well seeing somebody who would absolutely have fitted the bill fitted the bill for the bill, because he was close to death, he was in pain, he was suffering, and so forth. My job was to assess his mental state, which took a while, but after we'd assessed it, we treated his depression. Within a couple of weeks, he was totally different, and by this stage, the physicians had also sorted out things to do with his pain. He died a couple of weeks later, but he was in a totally different state. We know that when people say that they want to die, there's often other things going on. And we know that the statement that I want to die is not a stable statement. It's a statement which changes over time. And research has shown that people who say that they want to die, if you go back and see them later on, especially if you put in some sort of support or treatment, they no longer say that they want to die.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So we've got 4 minutes left and we've got 5 people who want to speak. So I'm going to go to Malcolm and then Nathan and then Azim. I'm afraid that's all we're going to have time for, but briefly, if you could.
Thank you. Very quickly, can I just, if I may, put Kit right about this idea of life is sacred? I can't speak for other faiths. Christians do not believe life is sacred in the sense that you have to prolong it against all other questions. We believe life after death, so it isn't sacred in that sense. That term is often used as a way of discrediting objections to assisted suicide by saying it's a religious concept, the objection, which those who don't share the religion can't share, and therefore religious people shouldn't impose their idea of the sacred on others. We do not believe life is sacred. We can have a conversation about this, which is actually much more about the position of the vulnerable.
Thank you. Nathan.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do some very rapid fact checking around this. So Nick Spencer, excellent point, but he talked about the slippery slope. Can you guarantee that we won't go down the slippery slope? The answer is yes, we can guarantee it. The courts in the UK have said that this is a matter for Parliament. This is not a matter for the courts. So wherever Parliament puts that line in the sand, that's where the line will be. And that's why it's so important that we get this right in the first round. There's been a lot of chat about doctors. Every single country that has an assisted dying law has a conscientious objection clause for doctors. We haven't seen the bill yet, but there will definitely be a conscientious objection clause within this bill. And that's something Humanist UK advocates for naturally. So no one will touch this who doesn't want to go near it. That's very much important about everything else. And quickly touch upon palliative care. There's so much you can say. The 2 things I'm going to really pick out are, the first is the Office of Health Economics a couple of years ago did a report that found that more than 5,000 people every single year, even with the best palliative care, would die in horrible pain and suffering. I spoke to someone recently, their husband was on the legal limit of morphine. They had excellent palliative care, and their husband every single day for the last 2 weeks of his life begged him to put a pillow over his head. That's disgusting and traumatic for everybody involved. And any system that goes, that's a good system, we should keep that, is clearly wrong, is clearly broken. And then there was a 14-month inquiry into assisted dying in the UK, and one of the core recommendations that said, one of the core findings was, where assisted dying is introduced, palliative care either remains the same or improves.
Thank you. I'm sorry it's so rushed at the end. It's always the same. Azim, can I ask you to wrap up, please, your reflections?
I think one of the things about this particular debate is, as we heard from Kit earlier, there are experiences people will have which are very harrowing, which are very disturbing around their desire to potentially end their suffering or end their lives. But I think the stress that we want to put on is that the nature of this debate means you can't really bring that into discussion, because for every experience of someone wanting to end their life, there will be an experience of the potentially horrible circumstances someone might be in once that option is put on the table for ending your life prematurely. There's a particular balance that has to be had between those experiences, and that's where we have to step back. And I come back to that question of sacred. I know, Malcolm, you wanted to say this is a social question, but sacred isn't just a theological concept. In society, we do hold things sacred, which aren't necessarily related to beliefs around deities or the end of life. It can be a social commitment we make to one another. And I think it's the nature of the implications on that commitment that we discuss as part of this. Once it's on the table that one can end their life, once that becomes part of the medical industry, once that becomes part of the way in which we treat the elderly or the ill or the infirm or the disabled or those who are in vulnerable circumstances, we can't undo that easily. And so that discussion has to be first and foremost. And I think that's where I really want to stress my own particular perspective. But I will end it there.
Thanks very much. And thank you, everyone, it was an impassioned debate, a difficult debate, and I'm sure we will have another one. So we'll keep in touch with you all on that. Thank you very much for joining.